Welcome to Lesson 4, Relating Fractions to Decimals. So in this lesson, before we get into our conversation about decimals, let's take a look at a basic place value chart and talk about the values of the different numbers. So if you saw this number 273 on a place value chart, you already know that the 2 is actually not worth 2, but is worth 200. So if this was a dollar amount, $273, the 2 is worth $200. The 7, because it's in a tens spot, 7 tens make 70. And 3, being in the 1 spot, is worth $3. So when we add these up, 200 plus 70 plus 3, we get the total of 273. Now our place value chart continues to the right as the numbers get smaller. So you probably already knew that there was a decimal point after the 1 spot if we're going to the right. And now all the numbers to the right represent really small numbers, numbers that are less than 1. So if we look at this 4, it is in the 10th spot, not to be confused with the tens spot. Notice they're spelt and pronounced differently. This is the 10th spot. So 4 tenths can be written as a fraction like this, 4 out of 10, 4 tenths. Which means if you had a pizza that was divided into 10 equal parts, you would have 4 of them, which is obviously less than one whole pizza. Now it could also be written as a decimal like this, 0.4. Up here they didn't put the 0, they just put decimal 4, and that's okay as well. Okay, and if this was money, we would be talking about 40 cents. Because you can always add an extra 0 here at the end. So this is actually 40 cents, because if you divide a dollar into 10 equal parts, you would have dimes, which are 10 cents each, and if you have 4 of those dimes, you have 40 cents. Now hopefully that makes sense. Next we have this 6, and it's in the hundredths spot, which means that it's 6 out of 100. So 6 out of 100, there are 100 pennies or cents in a dollar, and if you have 6 of them, you have 6 cents. So it is written as a decimal like this, 0.06. Okay? And even though the number 6 is bigger than the number 4, which one was worth more, the 4 tenths or the 6 hundredths? Think about that for a moment. The 4 tenths is worth more because that was worth 40 cents, while the 6 tenths is only 6 hundredths, I should say, my mistake, is only worth 6 cents. So you could see as you go to the right on this place value charts, the amounts, the values get smaller and smaller. They get less than less. Here's our biggest value, $200, and these values here are all less than $1. So let's look at the last place on our place value chart. This place is called thousandths, which means if you took a pizza and you were able to cut it into 1,000 equal parts, you would have thousandths. And since there's an 8 here in the thousandth spot, we would say we have 8 out of 1,000. Now it's probably not possible to cut a pizza into 1,000 parts. They'd all be so tiny, there'd barely be anything there. But that's what that means. So you could imagine that 8 thousandths is a very tiny amount. It's actually, if we're talking about money, less than 1 penny. There isn't even a money value for this amount, and it's written like this, 0.008. So that's 8 thousandths. Now I just want to point something out here. Notice how 8 thousandths, if you were to look at it backwards and ignore the decimal point, you would see the number 8,000 because it's 8 with 3 zeros. So if we flipped it around, 8 thousandths flip backwards without the decimal makes 8,000. So that's maybe another little trick you can use to remember that one. So here's another place value chart that shows both the fractions and the decimals of the tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. Let's look at an example of a fraction. Let's say that we have 4 out of 25. So the question is, how can we turn this into a decimal? Well, if it was 4 out of 100, that would be pretty easy because the answer would be 4 hundredths. But our fraction is not out of 100, it's out of 25. So you have to ask yourself the question, can I turn this into an equivalent fraction that is out of 25, or out of 100, or maybe out of 10? And here's a little trick with fractions. I know that I can multiply 25 times 4 to make 100. This only works with multiplying and dividing, but as long as I can do the same thing to the numerator and denominator of my fraction, see how I'm multiplying both the top and bottom by 4? Then the new fraction that I get over here is equivalent. So 4 times 4 I know makes 16. So 16 out of 100 is 16 hundredths. So now it's pretty easy to turn into a decimal, because there'd be a 1 in this spot and a 6 in this spot and a decimal here. So that would make 16 hundredths. See how the 6 here is in the hundredth spot? It's 2 spots after the decimal, and 2 spots after the decimal is the hundredth spot. And because my fraction ends here in the hundredth spot, this makes 16 hundredths. So both are read the same way. This is read 16 hundredths, and this is read 16 hundredths. Okay? So let's review that one more time. If I have a fraction out of a 10 or 100 or 1,000, it's really quick and easy to turn into a decimal. But oftentimes your fractions are not out of 10, 100, or 1,000. But if you could turn it into an equivalent fraction that is out of 100 or 10 or 1,000, then you can create a decimal. So what I did here was multiply 25 by 4 to make 100. And because I multiplied the bottom number by 4, I have to multiply the top number by 4. And 4 times 4 is 16. And 16 hundredths is also written like this, 16 hundredths. Let me show you a real simple way to do that on your calculator. So on your calculator, remember the original fraction was 4 out of 25. So I want to turn that into a decimal. Remember that a fraction is a division question. So it's always top divided by bottom. So 4 divided by 25. And if you punch that into your calculator, surprise, surprise, you're going to get this decimal here. Okay? So as long as, that's probably the easiest way to do it, but it's also important to understand how it works. So let's look at one more quick example. Here I have 2/5. Now I'm going to ask myself, can I turn this into a fraction that's out of 10? And I can, because I know that 5 times 2 is 10. And so if I multiply the bottom by 2, I have to multiply the top by 2. And 2 times 2, of course, makes 4. So 4 tenths, I know as a decimal, if I put on my place value chart, looks like this. And if I wanted to just do it really quickly and easily on my calculator, if I punch in on my calculator 2 divided by 5, like that, from my original fraction, then I will get the decimal 0.4. And when I write in my 0.4, I'm going to write it right below my place value chart. I notice that the 4 is in the 10th spot, so that's why it's called 4 tenths. In the previous example, I had 0.16, and because the 6 is in the 100th spot, this is called 16 hundredths. So pick the strategy that works for you and have fun converting fractions to decimals.